Since the advent of the automobile in the early 20th century, various auto manufacturers have competed against one another in efforts to increase their overall market share within this booming industry. Naturally, advertisements play a crucial role in this process, and these auto manufacturers often use the medium of advertisements to flaunt their brand superiority over their direct competitors. Over the years, these ads have of course evolved to better appeal to potential buyers in hopes of swaying them to buy one of their vehicles. Pickup truck advertisements in particular tend to utilize this comparative style in their advertising, since a truck's towing capacity and performance while towing a heavy load is in fact a key selling point, and these displays of towing superiority have long since strayed into the realm of pure absurdity, and at the peak of this advertising trend's popularity in the late 2000s and early 2010s, these commercials would feature pickup trucks hauling heavy loads of general construction equipment through unreasonably steep or otherwise somewhat unrealistic conditions. And serving as a prime example of this, I very distinctly remember a commercial where a Toyota truck ascends a Mad Max-esque spiraling metal tower, complete with a bunch of flamethrowers. Now, I did manage to find this commercial again, and hopefully showing it doesn't get this video copyright claimed, because it's pretty much exactly what I remembered. I'm sure some of my viewers who don't live in North America, where pickup trucks are not nearly as popular for everyday use by general consumers, and haven't been barraged by similarly outlandish advertisements, might naturally be wondering, well, why does this entire commercial exist? When would this ever be something anyone would need their truck to be able to do? What are they building up there? A bunker? And how'd they get it down? Do they just say, "Yeah, hey driver, you just walk down. We'll just push the truck over the edge or something. Good shoot. Nice work here today, fellas." Truth be told, I don't really have the answers to any of these questions myself, although I find the commercial to be quite ironic, as Toyota arguably had the least to prove regarding their pickup's rugged reliability and towing capabilities, as their trucks had already proven such in a real-world conflict with arguably even harsher conditions than their contrived flamethrower Tower of Doom, taking place in the harsh expanses of the Sahara Desert. These Toyota trucks would not only prove that they were reliable, tough, and capable of high performance while under heavy loads, but also during this conflict, Toyota trucks would also be utilized in head-to-head combat with hundreds of T-55 tanks, and would not only emerge victorious in these encounters, they would prove to be so particularly devastating and pivotal in the outcome of this conflict that the entire war would become forever directly linked to the Japanese auto manufacturer, as this conflict would become widely known as the Great Toyota War. Now, a majority of viewers watching this video have probably only heard of this conflict in passing at best, which can largely be attributed to the overall lack of press coverage the Great Toyota War received in North American and Western media altogether. In this video, I will do my best to explain the events leading up to the conflict and the major events during the conflict, and in the process, we'll explain exactly why these Japanese trucks played such a central and pivotal role in the outcome of the conflict. As I've stated in my other previous videos detailing other armed conflicts, war is inherently often extremely complex by nature, so I will also do my best to thoroughly explain the motivations driving all of the factions involved in the fighting, as it is crucial to understand that all of the soldiers in the factions involved in the conflict naturally assume that they are the good guys and that their opposition are simply the bad guys, although in reality, nowhere across history has ever been as simple as this. The lead up to the Great Toyota War, as is the case with many modern conflicts in Africa, would begin to take shape during a period between the 1830s up until the onset of World War I in 1914. During this time span, the entire continent of Africa would draw the attention of imperialist Western European nations who began to establish footholds across the continent. The colonists from these Western European imperialist nations would soon devolve into a scramble against one another to claim territory across Africa as they became increasingly aware of the vast amount of natural resources there that could be exploited and profited from. This imperialist expansionism often would draw significant ire from the local people. However, tragically, they were ultimately largely incapable of resisting against this expansion across the continent, as while they did greatly outnumber the European colonists, the Europeans came armed with firearms, which were used with devastating efficiency against the armies of locals that dared oppose their rule. By the 1870s, the tensions between these Western European imperialist nations had grown significantly, and so, to strengthen their territorial claims, they began to directly install rulers and governmental infrastructure in these claimed territories, while also continuing their outward expansion across the continent. This would prove to be a devastating time period for the local people, who would suffer countless atrocities at the hand of these installed imperialist governments, and furthermore, this method of direct rule would result in a period of rapid border expansion for the Western European imperialists. In 1870, approximately 10% of Africa had been formally claimed by Western European countries. However, by the beginning of World War I in 1914, these figures had ballooned to approximately 90% of the continent being claimed by these Western European imperialist empires. Notably, the Europeans' territorial claims would lead to the establishment of borders with no regard at all for the previous historical borders defined by the locals, which often resulted in formerly independent local communities and many of their generational foes from other such communities being subjugated under one singular rule. The conclusion of World War II would bring about a worldwide shift in attitude towards imperialist empires, and over the following few years, these European-claimed African colonies would cede rulership back to the locals. However, it was during this time that the repercussions of the European imperialists' disregard for the complex politics of the locals while defining their colonies' borders would begin to emerge. In 1963, 32 leaders of newly independent African nations would go on to form the Organization of African Unity, and in 1964, the OAU would discuss the matter of these borders and would ultimately decide to keep the European established borders intact, citing a fear of regional instability and conflict as the main reason for their decision to do so. Ironically, however, it is this very ruling that would ultimately result in decades of civil unrest, countless wars, and power struggles across the continent. One such newly independent African nation and OAU member state was the nation of Chad, which had gained its independence from its former imperialist ruler France in the year 1960, with the top leadership role in the country being assumed by a man named Francois Tombalbaye. Notably, Tombalbaye was an ethnic Sara, the largest ethnic group in Chad, hailing from the southern portion of the nation. However, Tombalbaye would prove to be an extremely unpopular ruler with the ethnic Muslim population, which was mostly concentrated in the northern portion of the country. By 1965, tensions between Tombalbaye's government and the ethnic Muslims in the country had reached a boiling point, erupting into a civil war between the Tombalbaye government's troops, which were known as Forces Armées Chadiennes, or the acronym FAT, and a group of ethnic Muslim rebels in the north known as Front de Libération Nationale du Chad, or the acronym FRONILAT. And for the sake of this video not sounding like a spelling bee, I'm going to pronounce that one phonetically, but this is really the only faction I'm going to do this with, and you'll see why that's the case as we go on here. Anyways, in 1970, the neighboring nation of Libya, which had recently come under the control of Muammar Gaddafi the previous year in 1969, would begin to supply the Frontenac rebels with weapons and training, and would also help orchestrate an attempted coup against Tombalbaye in 1971, which would ultimately end in failure, and Tombalbaye immediately severed all diplomatic ties with Libya as a result. In September of 1971, Libya would continue to escalate tensions with the Chadian government by declaring their formal recognition of Frontenac as the sole governmental party of Chad. However, by the spring of 1972, Tombalbaye's government had become increasingly desperate as FAT forces had been consistently losing ground in their struggle against the Frontenac insurgency, and so Tombalbaye would reopen diplomatic relations with Libya. With the tides of the civil war continuing to turn against Tombalbaye and his FAT forces, in November of 1972, he would meet with Gaddafi in secret, where he allegedly brokered a deal with Libya to cede control of the Aouzou Strip, which is located in the northernmost reaches of Chad, bordering Libya, in exchange for $100 million in aid. The following month, in December of 1972, Chad and Libya would sign a declaration of friendship, and Libya would subsequently publicly denounce Frontenac and would expel its leadership from within the country as well, as Libya would continue to cozy up with the Tombalbaye regime over the following few years. These friendly relations between the two nations would abruptly come to an end in 1975, however, when Francois Tombalbaye was removed from power and killed during a coup d'etat, and was subsequently replaced by the new regime with a man named Félix Malloum. Notably, this coup was largely motivated by the military's disapproval of Tombalbaye's cozying up to Libya, and thus the Gaddafi regime would see the new government as a threat to their influence in the region, and would once again begin to supply the Frontenac rebels, fueling the continuation of the civil conflict despite the removal of Tombalbaye from power. Notably, upon his rise to power, Félix Malloum would appoint a man named Hissène Habré as Chad's prime minister and vice president in August of 1978 as an effort to solidify his regime's rule of Chad. Habré had formerly been a high-ranking and popular leader within Frontenac and had opted to accept this role within the government after having major disagreements with another prominent Frontenac leader named Goukouni Ouédé. These disagreements would also lead to Frontenac fracturing into several smaller rebel factions as a result, and Ouédé's rebels would continue to clash with the Maloum regime's FAT troops. However, Habre's relationship with the Maloum regime would quickly sour, and by 1979, Habre had once again turned against Maloum and would lead rebel forces to capture the capital of Chad the same year in 1979. This in turn prompted Maloum to formally resign, ceding control of Chad to a new transitional government that was to be led by Ouédé and Habre, with the transition of power being formally ratified in a treaty known as the Lagos Accords. The Lagos Accords would outline the power structure for this new transitional government, with Ouédé assuming the role of president and Habre assuming the position of defense minister of this new regime, which would come to be known as Gouvernement d'Union Nationale de Transition, or GUNT for short. Over the years following, Ouédé would begin to adopt a pro-Libyan stance as his relationship with Habre again began to sour. However, Ouédé's increasing ties to Libya would ultimately prove unpopular with many of his former rebel supporters, who would rally against him in another insurgency led by Habre. In 1982, rebel forces led by Habre managed to seize control of the country, ousting Ouédé and the GUNT from power, subsequently forcing Ouédé to flee the country to Libya in exile. Upon seizing control of Chad, Habre would set to work consolidating his rule over the country and would assume the role of president of a single-party military dictatorship regime. During his exile in Libya, Ouédé and his GUNT rebels would regroup and, with the backing of Libya, would begin their insurgency anew against Habre's government troops, which were known as the Forces Armées du Nord, or the acronym FAN. The Ouédé-led GUNT insurgency was met by fierce resistance from FAN troops, and Habre would further aim to solidify his control over Chad by beginning to establish closer diplomatic relations with Western powers, and in particular, France. Habre would go on to further bolster his regime's military's numbers and overall strength in February of 1983, when FAN would formally integrate remnants of the Tombalbaye and Maloum-era military faction from earlier in the video, FAT, with the two factions combining to form a faction known as Forces Armées Nationales Chadiennes, otherwise known by the acronym FANT. In late 1982, the Libyan-backed GUNT rebel troops had advanced into northern Chad as part of the first step of their efforts to re-establish footholds in the northernmost reaches of Chad. However, they would be caught off guard by a series of unexpected FANT counteroffensives that were launched against them in December of 1982 and January of 1983. These FANT counteroffensives would significantly disrupt the GUNT rebels' advances, and in hopes of countering this loss of momentum, Libya would ramp up its efforts to provide GUNT troops with training and weaponry. Libya's increase of support would indeed prove to be a great boon to the GUNT rebels, who began to establish control over northern Chad with a string of victories throughout the spring of 1983. While they stopped just short of outright supporting the GUNT rebels publicly, Libya's blatant backing of Ouédé and the GUNT rebels had drawn the attention and condemnation of several Western powers, including France and the United States, and by the summertime, Habré and his FANT troops had now secured backing of their own, with reinforcement troops arriving from Zaire, shipments of weapons imported from France, and a huge supply of food and aid money from the United States. This newfound backing would prove to be a major boon for FANT forces, who quickly swung the momentum of the conflict back into their favor with a string of victories, and by early August, the GUNT rebel forces were teetering on the edge of defeat. Now growing increasingly desperate to ensure Habré and the highly anti-Libyan FANT would not remain in control of Chad, Gaddafi would give the order for Libyan troops to begin their direct intervention in the conflict, and dispatched 11,000 troops along with artillery and aircraft support to ensure GUNT's advance back into northern Chad. On August 10th, Habré and his 5,000 or so FANT troops would suffer heavy casualties of about 4,300 of these troops during a Pyrrhic defense while attempting to slow the Libyan and GUNT advance. However, despite suffering heavy losses, the now open involvement of Libyan troops in the conflict had drawn the ire of France, who would dispatch 2,700 troops to Chad, and the French troops would define a line of incursion along the 15th parallel and demanded that neither GUNT nor Libyan troops cross this line, as doing such would invoke a retaliatory strike with the full force of France's wrath. This French intervention would grind the conflict to a halt, resulting in a stalemate until the spring of 1984, when an Ethiopian-backed GUNT offensive would cross the line of incursion. However, they were rapidly repelled by the French troops, and another small-scale attempt to capture an FANT-held outpost near the 15th parallel was also swiftly dispatched by the French troops. In response, the French would retaliate with several devastating air attacks and advanced into former GUNT-held territories to establish a new line of incursion along the 16th parallel. In late April of 1984, Gaddafi would propose that he would withdraw his Libyan troops from the conflict with the conditions that France would in turn do the same. By November, French troops had withdrawn from the region. However, Libya had only partially completed their withdrawal, leaving around 3,000 troops stationed in northern Chad. This had essentially split Chad into two de facto states, with the GUNT-controlled north and the FANT-controlled south, setting the stage for the Great Toyota War, which would take place in the near future. Now, there's actually a bit more lead up to the start of the Toyota War. However, the major players involved and overall control of the two de facto states in Chad would remain largely the same after France, of course, would resume support of FANT forces after becoming aware that Libya had failed to honor their end of the agreement. While there was quite a bit of back and forth small-scale fighting between the two factions between 1984 and the start of 1987, due to this fighting largely resulting in negligible changes of territorial control for both the Libyan-backed GUNT rebels and the Habré-led and French-backed FANT troops during this time span, with most of the fighting being interspersed with tense stalemate periods between the North and South factions. I'm going to gloss over a majority of the details of the fighting in these years leading up to the onset of the Toyota War in 1987. However, it is worth mentioning that by 1985, Ouaidi's desire to wrest control of Chad away from Habré's regime had significantly diminished, and Gaddafi would subsequently imprison him, fearing that he was close to negotiating a truce with Habré. This imprisonment of Awede would subsequently cause GUNT to splinter, with Awede's supporters forming a faction known as Forces Armées Populaires, otherwise known as the acronym FAP for short, and the formerly pro-Libyan FAP troops would now find themselves allied with Habré's FANT troops, as the former GUNT rebels would further disintegrate into ever more splintered factions. Habré and his FANT forces would become further unified, as only very thinly veiled Libyan-backed puppet rebel factions remained in opposition to Habré's regime by 1987. With FANT troops now numbering around 10,000, they now finally possessed the numbers advantage against the Libyan-backed puppet rebel factions. However, unlike the Libyan forces, FANT was lacking in firepower to truly go toe-to-toe against the tanks, artillery, and aircraft support Libya provided them. However, between 1984 and 1987, the French had emerged as Habré and FANT's most valuable allies, whom they knew they could readily rely on to provide air support to repel Libyan aircraft, and the French would also continue to supply them with a steady influx of weapons and supplies to properly equip the rapidly rising number of FANT troops. Amongst the equipment that was supplied to FANT by the French was several hundred Toyota trucks modified for traversing across desert terrain, along with shipments of Milan missile launchers to mount on the trucks, transforming the Toyotas into technicals that could be utilized against Libyan armored vehicles during their efforts to eradicate the Libyan-backed insurgency and drive the Libyan troops from within their borders. Now equipped with vehicles to aid in their efforts, FANT were confident that they would be able to bring an end to the decades of fighting in northern Chad. And so, on January 2nd, 1987, between 4,000 and 5,000 FANT troops were dispatched to begin an assault on a vital Libyan communications stronghold in northern Chad, Fada. The base was heavily fortified by 2,000 Libyan and Conseil Démocratique Révolutionnaire, or CDR troops, with the CDR representing the main Libyan puppet offshoot group that had splintered from GUNT during its collapse, along with possessing artillery and mounted fortifications at the base. The defending Libyan and CDR troops also were equipped with over 100 T-55 tanks and over 30 armored anti-personnel vehicles. The FANT troops would be led by a 30-year-old man named Hassan Jamou, a fiery young commander who is well respected by the FANT troops. Furthermore, many of the FANT troops were intimately familiar with the areas surrounding Fada, and thus they were also aware of multiple different ways to access the base, including several secret access entrances. The FANT troops would ride into battle in their Toyota Technicals in an all-out offensive to storm Fada as quickly as possible. FANT would utilize their Toyota's superior mobility and maneuverability and spread the trucks out across the desert, and they swiftly surrounded the defending forces as they zoomed around the desert and the slower Libyan armored vehicles, utterly decimating them in a modern-day display of tactics not all too dissimilar to how the Mongol armies decimated the European armies fielded against them. In a matter of just a few short hours, the FANT troops had decisively managed to capture Fada, destroying a staggering 92 T-55 tanks and a further 33 armored anti-personnel vehicles, inflicting a total of 784 casualties against the defenders. The FANT troops, in return, had only suffered the loss of 3 Toyota trucks and a total of 18 casualties in their efforts to take Fada. This major loss put the CDR and the Libyan troops supporting them on the back foot, and after being caught off guard by the sudden loss of Fada, Gaddafi would order a retreat of Libyan troops to the northernmost reaches of Chad in an effort to regroup and retaliate against the FANT offensive. Furthermore, in February, Gaddafi ordered a bombing of the city of Arada, which was seemingly ordered to show the French their blatant disregard for their line of incursion at the 16th parallel, and in return, French airstrikes were conducted against the Libyan radar array and runway at a Libyan airbase known as Ouad Doum. These French airstrikes would prove to be devastating for the coordination of the Libyan CDR troops stationed in the region over the upcoming months, as FANT troops continued their steady advance into northern Chad and towards the Libyan border. At around this same time, Gaddafi would also dispatch 11,000 additional troops, including some of Libya's most elite soldiers, the Revolutionary Guard, to northern Chad to help reinforce their reeling armies and to slow down the FANT's advance. However, despite these efforts on behalf of the Libyans, the FANT would continue their push northwards towards the Libyan border, and in March of 1987, they were now poised to attempt to wrest control of Ouad Doum from Libyan troops and the CDR. However, Ouad Doum was even more heavily defended than Fada had been, with a garrison of over 5,000 CDR and Libyan troops, along with a large number of tanks and armored vehicles, as well as a vast minefield to boot. Utilizing a similar strategy to how they had taken Fada, the FANT troops would again employ their Toyota trucks to outmaneuver their superiorly armed opposition, as the trucks were easily able to zip through the minefields at speeds of up to 100 kilometers per hour, with little fear of activating the mines, as the mines were anti-vehicle mines designed to counter armored vehicles, and thus the Toyota trucks were in actuality too light to actually trigger them, not unlike the penguins on the beaches of the Falkland Islands, which I covered in a previous video. FANT would again utilize their significantly superior mobility granted by their Toyota Technicals to decimate the underprepared and much less mobile Libyan armor, and as the tides of the clash had clearly begun to shift into FANT's favor, many of the defending troops would begin to abandon the airbase and fled into the surrounding desert, where many of them were then summarily mowed down by machine gun fire from FANT troops in their Toyotas. As word of their imminent loss of Ouad Doum reached Libyan leadership, they began to conduct airstrikes against the base itself in an effort to destroy their own equipment to deny it from being captured by the FANT troops swarming the base. The retreating Libyan troops that had managed to escape began to flock to Matan as-Sara, a Libyan military base that, notably, was actually in Libya. Gaddafi would announce, following FANT's capture of Ouad Doum, that Libya had actually won the battle and were in fact withdrawing from Chad to allow for the remainder of the war to play out without their intervention. However, Gaddafi's claims of victory would ring hollow after analyzing the actual results of the battle, as the defenders had suffered over 3,000 casualties during the fighting, and the one-sided battle had all but shattered the morale of the CDR and Libyan troops, and furthermore, the CDR would essentially dissolve entirely as a result, leaving just the Libyans opposing FANT and Habre's rule of the country. Additionally, the Libyan troops remaining suffered from poor morale, as many soldiers began to question why they were in Chad in the first place, and as Gaddafi had purposefully undertrained a majority of his troops to prevent the possibility of a coup against him, this mindset would rapidly permeate amongst the Libyan forces. FANT troops would continue their push north throughout the coming months, and by August of 1987, they had reached the Aouzou Strip, the border region that Gaddafi had long since claimed as Libyan territory. FANT forces would begin their efforts to capture the town of Aouzou from under Libyan control, and by utilizing familiar tactics, FANT and their Toyotas would inflict hundreds more Libyan casualties whilst facing much lighter resistance from the Libyan troops, as the high intensity of the clash combined with the already low morale of the defenders would shatter their will to fight, and many would subsequently abandon their defenses and would attempt to flee instead. However, the Libyans would, in response, mount a number of counterattacks in their attempt to retake the town from the 400 or so FANT troops garrisoned there, and they were successfully able to retake the town of Aouzou by the end of August, utilizing a combination of close-range airstrikes and, somewhat ironically, a large number of mobile troops in jeeps and Toyota trucks. However, the Libyan forces would have little time to relish in their first victory of this war, as on September 5th, Habre would order FANT forces to proceed to attack the aforementioned Libyan military base, Matan Sara, in Libya, and despite Habre's pleas to the French for air support, they continued to summarily deny his requests, as the French were staunchly in opposition to any offensive actions taken by Habre on Libyan soil. Met by a defending Libyan force, now armed with their own fleet of Toyotas to counter FANTs, the resulting clash would result in much bloodshed on both sides. However, ultimately, FANT troops would again prove their resolve on the battlefield, as they did successfully manage to wrest the base from under Libyan control. Crucially, after they captured the airbase, FANT were able to destroy over 50 Libyan aircraft that were grounded there, which would serve as a huge blow to Libya's air force. In total, Libyan troops had suffered approximately 1,000 casualties during the battle, and FANT troops had managed to capture 300 additional prisoners as well. However, this was indeed a Pyrrhic victory for FANT, who had suffered between 500 and 1,000 casualties of their own. After wreaking destruction across the base, FANT troops would retreat from Libya back to Chad to reinforce their positions there. Habre had not only lobbied France for support of an incursion into Libya, but had also managed to draw the attention of the United States, who met with Habre several times, as they were keen on the idea of removing Gaddafi from power. However, after these meetings, the United States would provide Habre with over $30 million in aid money, as well as supplying them with Javelin missiles. But any potential future collaboration was brought to a swift conclusion as, following the attack on Matan Asara, the French would apply significant political pressure to Habré, demanding that he would accept a ceasefire should it be offered by Libya. On September 11th, 1987, the Organization of African Unity would present a ceasefire agreement to both parties, who both accepted the terms of this agreement, marking the conclusion of the Great Toyota War, and, to many people's surprise, no further fighting or breaches of the ceasefire would erupt over the following months and years. Thank you all for watching.